Good afternoon, my name is Kimberly Matunis, and this is a presentation on crisis communication. The communication theory is relevant to crisis communication. From a transmission perspective, information must go from the organization to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders must be given an opportunity to respond. In the following case, the organization is the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department, and the stakeholders are the general public. Before we get into how the communication crisis occurred, we have to know the facts surrounding the case. On August 9th, 2014, in Ferguson, Missouri, a young man robbed a convenience store, run the slide, and assaulted the store manager. This is a video depicting Brown entering the store. He took a carton of cigarettes. The store manager tried to stop him. Michael Brown shoves him back, assaulting him, comes back in, further intimidating him physically, exits the store with the merchandise. Okay, come out of that. The police would eventually come in contact with Michael Brown, and he was shot and killed. Those facts of the case are undisputed. How those facts transpire depends on who's telling the story. From this moment forward, the communication crisis begins as dozens of people provide different accounts of what happened. So essentially, the communication breakdown fuse is lit. Next slide. Okay, so we need to look at how a peaceful protest like this first started. Run the video. So as you can see, the protest was essentially peaceful. People were walking in the streets, holding their hands up. It almost looked like a parade at some points, but essentially it was a peaceful protest. Next slide. So what we have to find out is, how did it go from that to this? Rioting, looting, burning, throwing Molotov cocktails, run the video, and shooting at police.
In the shooting death of Michael Brown. Crowds looted many businesses, some burned to the ground. Police made more than 29 arrests in what they call the worst night of violence since the August shooting.
Gunfire rang out in the streets. Mobs of people destroyed police cars and threw bricks at officers. And because of the gunshots in the air, the FAA rerouted planes. Michelle Miller is in Ferguson. Michelle, good morning.
Okay.
Good morning, Nora.
Okay, so we need to figure out what went wrong and how the communication broke down, which caused this. Okay, so let's start looking at the mistakes that were made by the police department. Michael Brown's body was left on the ground for hours, and the area was not blocked off. Now, without getting into a long explanation of why a body needs to remain at a crime scene for hours, I will just let you know that it needs to occur so that the crime scene investigation unit can come in and properly process the scene. That involves a lot of steps. It does take some time. However, there was a lot of questions raised as to why his body was left on the ground for over 4 hours. One thing that the police could have done was bring in rolling curtains to sort of block off Michael Brown's body so that people couldn't see him. It doesn't happen like you see in the movies. You don't drape a blanket or a curtain over the actual body because that can taint evidence. Okay, next slide. Okay, another mistake that was made was the video of Michael Brown robbing the store was released to the public. So for crisis communication, this can be viewed as an attempt to transcend the attention off of the shooting by distracting or laying the foundation that Michael Brown was in fact a violent person. So in other words, the police showed this video to let everybody know that Michael Brown was a criminal and he was violent. Therefore, the shooting that occurred between Officer Wilson and Brown was probably justified. Additionally, another thing that was done wrong was the initial peaceful protests were met by police already in riot gear. So they were basically already suited up for a fight. And that was a missed opportunity to engage in peaceful communication with the citizens. Okay, next slide. Okay, the Ferguson, Missouri police chief should have informed the family and the public about the facts of the case that they knew so far, and they did not. They should have reached out to the American Civil Liberties Union and asked if a representative could come and help facilitate a conversation between the family and the public and the police department, and that also was not done. Later, the ACLU did come, but they interjected themselves into the case as opposed to being invited in. And the police chief should have immediately apologized for the loss of life. Not apologizing for the shooting, because sometimes that can mistakenly come across as guilt, but he should have apologized for the loss of life. Okay, next slide. Additionally, one of the next things that happened was President Obama addressed the nation regarding the shooting. The president urged people to remain calm. However, the next thing he said was critical, because he said that the police should not use excessive force. So this maybe inadvertently relayed a message to the public that the president thinks that the police do use excessive force, and they may have done so in this case. So that was a communication mistake, whether it was intentional or not on the part of the president. So according to the crisis communication theory and practice, communication is not synonymous with understanding. So again, just because the president was discussing the case doesn't mean he had a full understanding of what happened from beginning to end. Okay, next slide. Okay. After the shooting, several people started uploading on social media video of Michael Brown's body laying on the ground. The media started showing up and was talking to anybody that would basically give them a statement. People said that they were eyewitnesses. They stated they saw Officer Wilson shoot Michael Brown in the back of the head. Others said they said that they saw Officer Wilson walk over to him and shoot him while he was laying on the ground. And others stated that they saw Officer Wilson shoot Michael Brown while he had his hands in the air. That last statement is critical, because that launched the whole hands up, don't shoot movement. The police didn't respond to any of this because they had to wait for the results of the autopsy. That's the difficult part in cases like this. You would like to immediately refute these statements and say, no, he wasn't shot in the manner that people were saying he was, but they couldn't because they didn't have the results of the autopsy yet. So that's a difficult situation right there. Next slide. So for these reasons and more, lack of communication, lack of bringing the family in for discussions, that caused the peaceful protests to turn violent. Okay, next slide. So let's look at what was done right. The Missouri State Police joined the investigation and ultimately took the investigation over, which is proper in a case like this. Additionally, the FBI and the Department of Justice got involved in the investigation. Obama sent the Attorney General Eric Holder to the scene to assist in the investigation. That was a critical move for the president to do, because it was at this point that the rioting and the chaos stopped after it had been going on for 10 days. Additionally, 3 independent autopsies were allowed to happen. The first one done by the police department, the second was done by a medical examiner requested by the Brown family, and the third was done by the Department of Justice. All 3 autopsies concurred and supported Officer Wilson's account of what happened, that Brown was not shot in the back of the head or the back, and he did not have his hands raised in surrender. Unfortunately, again, this came too late because the rioting and the chaos had already started. Additionally, witnesses were given the opportunity to give sworn testimony anonymously. Now, that's also critical because people are less willing to come forward to say that the police officer was actually justified in shooting, because they could now potentially be at risk in their own communities. So this was very critical that they were allowed to give their testimony anonymously. Next slide. Okay, some of the lessons that we learned from this case. We learned that you need to offer an immediate apology for stakeholders in any case, and in this case, for the loss of life to the general public. You need to communicate with the family and share as much as you can up until the point where where you don't want to just jeopardize the investigation. Communicate with the public is vital in early stages. The community wants to know what happened, and they don't want to hear, because of police procedures, we can't tell you. They really need to be made to understand why. And a thorough explanation needs to happen to not appease the community, but to rightfully inform them of what happened in police procedures. And we learned that you can release facts as soon as they're confirmed, as opposed to waiting until the entire investigation completed. Because again, people want to know, they want to be kept in the loop as to what happens as it's transpiring. Okay, some more lessons learned. When issues like this happen, particularly police shootings where race is involved, you want to call in the community leaders and communicate to help communicate with the citizens. Property damage and relatively minor theft in the middle of a violent protest should be allowed to play out, with the exceptions to actions involving like arson that could injure or get people killed. Now, business owners don't want to hear that you're just going to let their business burn to the ground. However, we've seen now historically in riots that when the police show up, when things like that happen, almost nothing's going to stop that activity. And if the police show up, it's just going to add fuel to that fire. So one of the lessons learned here is just to let that activity play out. As long as no one's getting hurt, the property can be replaced. An additional thing that happened after this case was many U.S. police departments are now adopting the use of body cameras so that interactions with the public can be filmed from beginning to end. The Department of Justice reviews police departments' policies and any civil rights violations inquiries. That had already been happening historically, but as a result of this case, that has enhanced those investigations. Okay, at this time, I'll take any questions that anybody might have.